Calum Reid was the kind of man who could walk into a room and make the air go still. In Glasgow's criminal underworld, they called him the Ghost, a man who built an empire without raising his voice and destroyed lives without leaving a trace. But when betrayal crept in from within his own circle, the silence he ruled with turned into the sound of gunfire. What followed wasn't just revenge, it was the Gangland Execution that would change Scotland's underworld forever. In the late 1990s, Glasgow's streets were ruled not by law, but by fear. The city's underworld operated like a hidden empire, unseen yet deeply felt in every corner of its working-class neighborhoods. Out of this smoke-filled chaos, a man named Calum Reid began to rise. To the public, he was quiet, polite, almost invisible. But in the world beneath, he had earned a name that carried both awe and dread: the Ghost. He didn't shout or threaten. He didn't need to. His power came from precision. Every move calculated, every enemy quietly erased. Calum started his criminal life humbly, working in small-time car theft operations. He was meticulous, always planning 3 steps ahead. While others drank, boasted, and made mistakes, he kept his head down. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of a bigger crew that ran stolen vehicles between Glasgow and Manchester. Calum's efficiency made them rich, and soon he began forming his own network. By his late 20s, he had transformed from a backstreet hustler into a man controlling drug routes that stretched beyond Scotland's borders. Unlike most gang leaders of the time, Calum avoided public attention. He didn't flash cash or parade his power. He believed visibility was a weakness. His meetings happened in quiet pubs after hours, his instructions delivered through coded notes and trusted intermediaries. Police surveillance often found nothing more than whispers. And whispers were never enough to convict the Ghost. His men followed a strict code: loyalty, silence, and precision. Anyone who broke that code vanished, their disappearance becoming a cautionary tale across the city. But with power came pressure. Rival crews from Edinburgh and Dundee wanted a piece of his territory. New players from London began moving in, testing the strength of his grip. Calum handled these threats not with open violence, but with patience. He would wait, learn his enemy's weakness, and strike once, hard enough that no one else dared to challenge him. He understood that ruling through fear was fragile. Ruling through respect was permanent. And for a while, it worked. The Ghost's organization ran like a machine. Drugs flowed, money doubled, and his influence crept into every part of Glasgow's underworld. Despite his control, there was always something cold about Calum. He didn't seem driven by greed or revenge. It was as if the empire he built was not for wealth, but for order. Those who knew him said he had no family, no real friends, only his crew and his rules. Some believed he had seen violence in his youth, something that had hardened him into the man he became. Others thought he simply enjoyed the game, the danger, the secrecy, the illusion of being everywhere and nowhere at once. By the end of the decade, Calum Reid had become a ghost in more than name. His enemies feared him, the police couldn't touch him, and his men worshipped him. But what no one realized then was that even a ghost can be haunted. And the betrayal that would soon come from within his own ranks would bring his carefully built empire crashing down. By 2003, Calum Reid's empire stood at its peak. His organization controlled the docks, the distribution routes, and most of the city's illegal trade. Everything moved through his system like clockwork. Every deal checked, every face known. But even the most guarded fortress has a weak point, and for Calum, it came in the form of Euan Drummond. Euan was sharp, ambitious, and dangerously persuasive. He joined Calum's crew after a recommendation from one of Calum's lieutenants, claiming to have connections in the north that could expand their operations. He spoke the language of loyalty, respect, and opportunity. Calum, always hungry for efficiency, saw potential in him. Euan quickly proved himself. He ran his operations cleanly, never drew police attention, and doubled the profits from the Aberdeen docks within months. Calum rewarded him with more responsibility and, eventually, trust. For the first time in years, Calum allowed someone into his inner circle. He saw in Euan a younger version of himself, disciplined, clever, and cold when necessary. What he didn't see was the growing hunger in Euan's eyes, the kind that made men forget who gave them their power in the first place. Behind the calm surface, Euan was already plotting. He saw Calum not as a mentor, but as an obstacle. The empire was vast, the profits unimaginable, and the respect Calum commanded was something Euan craved for himself. He began meeting secretly with members of a rival outfit known as the Fourth Crew, a ruthless group from Edinburgh eager to move into Glasgow. The deal was simple. Euan would deliver Calum's drug shipments and routes in exchange for full control of Glasgow under their protection. It was treachery disguised as ambition. The betrayal began quietly. A shipment went missing at the docks, then another. Calum's accountants noticed inconsistencies, containers logged but never received, cash disappearing before it reached the books. Calum suspected theft, but not treason. He believed the problem came from corrupt dock workers or police interference. Euan used that to his advantage, stepping in to handle the issue, gaining even more of Calum's confidence. Each move Euan made pushed Calum further into isolation, surrounded by men who no longer knew whom to trust. By late summer, the situation worsened. Rival gangs began hitting Calum's supply lines with surgical precision. Warehouses were raided, drivers ambushed, and shipments vanished without a trace. The police intensified surveillance, and whispers spread that the ghost was losing his touch. In the underworld, weakness travels fast. Men who once spoke his name with fear now discussed him with doubt. Calum could feel it, the shift, the cracks in his empire. He tried to contain the damage, but the betrayal was spreading like rot from within. One evening, Calum's oldest lieutenant brought him a report. Coded messages traced back to Euan's crew, proof of contact with the Fourth Crew. It hit Calum like a knife to the chest. The man he trusted most, the one he had trained and promoted, had been selling him out piece by piece. For years, Calum had outsmarted rivals, avoided the police, and ruled with silence. But this was different. Betrayal from within was something even the ghost had never prepared for, and though he didn't show it, that discovery changed him. Something inside Calum Reid, the calm, the control, began to fracture. The empire he built on loyalty had just been poisoned by greed, and for the first time in his life, the ghost was no longer in control. The air in Glasgow was colder that January than anyone could remember. The city seemed tense, waiting for something unseen but inevitable. Calum Reid felt it too. The silence that comes before violence. For weeks, he had been moving cautiously, changing safe houses, altering routes, cutting contact with anyone he didn't trust. The betrayal had hardened him. He no longer looked for explanations, only enemies. Euan Drummond's treachery had set in motion a storm that Calum could not fully control. His once loyal lieutenants were turning uncertain, and the rival crews that had once feared him were suddenly bold. It was late one night when the first gunfire echoed through Buchanan Street. Calum's convoy, 3 black sedans moving through the heart of the city, was ambushed with terrifying precision. The attackers waited until the cars slowed at a traffic light near an empty building, then struck from both sides. Automatic fire tore through the vehicles, glass shattered, and the air filled with smoke and panic. Witnesses later said it lasted less than 30 seconds, but the damage was irreversible. When the police arrived, they found 3 of Calum's most trusted men dead. Their bodies were riddled with bullets, their weapons still untouched. Calum himself barely survived, pulled from the back seat of his car with blood on his face and rage in his eyes. The newspapers the next morning screamed with headlines, "Gangland Massacre on Buchanan Street." The public saw it as another episode of criminal violence. But for Glasgow's underworld, it was something else, a declaration of war. The message was clear. The ghost was vulnerable. Someone had not only betrayed him, but humiliated him. In a world built on fear and control, survival depended on reputation, and Calum's reputation had been shattered in a single night. He disappeared after that. For weeks there were no sightings, no movement, no word from his organization. Rivals assumed he was dead or hiding. Police surveillance teams found nothing. But while the city speculated, Calum was recovering and rebuilding in silence. His injuries were minor, but the wound to his pride ran deep. He spent his days studying every name, every shipment, every man who had crossed him. The list always led back to one name: Euan Drummond. In his hidden apartment on the outskirts of the city, Calum mapped out the entire betrayal like a crime scene. He marked locations, traced connections, and uncovered how Euan had fed his roots to the fourth crew. He realized the ambush had been designed not just to kill him, but to erase his empire entirely. But Calum Reid was not ready to vanish. If the underworld believed the ghost had been destroyed, he would prove them wrong in a way no one would forget. Something inside him had changed since that night. The man who once led through order and control was gone. In his place stood something colder, a figure consumed by vengeance. The calm strategist had turned into a predator. Every move he made now was personal, not business. He didn't want his empire back. He wanted blood. And in the dark, rain-soaked streets of Glasgow, that desire would soon take the city into one of the most brutal chapters in its criminal history. Months passed in silence, but it was the kind of silence that always meant something terrible was coming. Calum Reid had gone completely underground. The police thought he had fled the country, and his rivals believed he was finished. But Calum was still in Scotland, hiding in plain sight under a new name, quietly piecing together the fragments of his broken empire. He wasn't rebuilding it to rule again. He was rebuilding it to destroy one man. Every decision, every favor called in, every old contact revived, served one single purpose: the execution of Euan Drummond. He began with observation. Through a network of informants, Calum tracked Euan's every move. Euan was living like a king, spending freely, dressing in expensive suits, and meeting openly with members of the fourth crew. He had taken over several of Calum's old routes and was running them recklessly, flooding the city with product. To the public eye, he looked untouchable. A new power rising where the ghost had fallen. But Calum watched from the shadows, studying him, learning his patterns. Every Friday night, Euan met with his associates at a warehouse near Leith Docks. It was where deals were made, money exchanged, and shipments arranged. It was also where Calum decided the betrayal would end. The plan took weeks to perfect. Calum's small circle of loyal men had shrunk to only 3, but they were all that he needed. They rented a nearby unit under false names and began preparing. They installed hidden cameras, tapped phones, and bribed a few dock workers for access. Everything was calculated, every second rehearsed. Calum wanted no mistakes, no survivors, and no mercy. The ghost was about to return, not as a ruler, but as an executioner. The night of the hit was thick with fog, the kind that swallowed sound and hid faces. Euan arrived at the warehouse just after 9, laughing with his men, unaware of what waited inside. Calum and his crew were already there, dressed as dock workers, blending into the shadows. When the last man entered, the power suddenly cut. The lights died, plunging the warehouse into darkness. Confusion spread quickly. Shouts, footsteps, the sound of guns being drawn. Then the silence broke with a single, muffled shot. When the lights flickered back on, Euan Drummond was slumped over a steel chair, his hands bound by his own gold chain. A single bullet had passed cleanly through his temple. His men lay scattered nearby, some dead, others wounded, the air thick with gunpowder and panic. Calum stood over Euan's body, expressionless. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, only a strange, hollow calm. Before leaving, he took a can of red spray paint and wrote 2 words on the wall above the corpse. The Ghost. It was not a message to the police or the press. It was a message to the underworld, that the old order had returned, and betrayal had a price. By the time the police arrived, the killers were gone. All they found was the wreckage, shattered glass, spent shells, and a city that would never be the same. The headlines the next morning called it the Gangland Execution. For Scotland's criminal underworld, it was the night everything changed. The ghost had spoken again, and his voice echoed through Glasgow like a warning carved in blood. The morning after the execution, Glasgow awoke to chaos. The news spread faster than fire, racing through every pub, alley, and police station in the city. The Gangland Execution, the papers called it. The headlines screamed of a calculated killing, one carried out with military precision. Police arrived at the scene to find Euan Drummond dead in his chair, a bullet clean through his skull. The word, "The Ghost," painted above him like a signature. To the public, it was just another gang feud. But for those who understood the underworld, it was more than revenge. It was a statement. The ghost, they said, was back from the dead. The government couldn't ignore it. The scale of the violence, the boldness of the hit, and the fear it caused forced authorities to act. Within days, Operation Vantage was launched, one of the largest organized crime crackdowns in Scottish history. Teams of officers raided warehouses, safe houses, and businesses linked to Calum Reid's old empire. Dozens were arrested. Some of Calum's oldest allies, men who had stood with him for years, were dragged out of their beds in front of their families. Many tried to stay loyal, but under pressure, a few began to talk. The police were determined to dismantle everything Calum had built piece by piece until no trace of the ghost remained. As the net tightened, Calum vanished once again. He moved north, traveling through back roads and small villages until he reached the Highlands. There, under a false identity, he settled in a small, isolated cabin surrounded by pine forests and fog. He no longer spoke to anyone from the old days. The once feared king of Glasgow's underworld had become a ghost in the truest sense. Unseen, unheard, forgotten. He spent his days reading old newspapers, listening to the wind howl outside, and watching the world he once ruled crumble from afar. In the cities, chaos filled the vacuum his disappearance left behind. The fourth crew fractured without Euan's leadership, and new groups emerged, younger and more reckless than those before. Where Calum had ruled with structure and quiet control, these new figures ruled through chaos and greed. Shootings became more frequent, territory lines blurred, and alliances shifted overnight. The once organized underworld descended into disorder. In many ways, Calum's final act of vengeance had destroyed the balance he himself had maintained. His execution of Euan hadn't restored his power. It had burned down the foundation that supported it. The police eventually declared victory, claiming that Operation Vantage had ended a generation of organized crime. But on the streets, no one believed that. People whispered that Calum was still alive somewhere in the north, living quietly, watching, waiting. Some claimed he had grown old and frail, seen occasionally in remote markets under a new name. Others said he had died years ago, buried in an unmarked grave. Yet, now and then, when someone in the underworld disappeared without explanation, whispers would begin again, that the ghost had returned to settle one more score. In truth, no one ever saw Calum Reid again, but his legend survived him, haunting every man who tried to rise too fast or betray too soon. The ghost had vanished into the mist, but the fear he left behind never did. It lingered in every dark corner of Glasgow, in every whispered deal and unspoken threat. A reminder that in the underworld, power never truly fades. It only changes shape. And, in the silence of the Highlands, where no one could find him, Calum Reid remained what he had always been, a man both dead and alive, a shadow watching over the ruins of the world he once ruled. Years passed, and Glasgow changed. The old factories were replaced by apartment towers, and new faces walked the same streets that once echoed with the footsteps of men who lived and died in silence. The underworld had shifted, too. The generation that had ruled during Calum Reid's time was gone, arrested, dead, or simply irrelevant. In their place rose younger gangs, impatient and ruthless, driven not by the codes of loyalty and order but by greed and recklessness. Violence no longer followed reason, it followed impulse. Where the ghost had once ruled with precision, chaos now reigned. But even in this new world, Calum's shadow lingered. His name had become something whispered in bars and prisons, half myth, half warning. To the new generation of criminals, the ghost was a legend. The man who vanished after executing his own betrayer and who no one ever saw again. Some said he had been killed in the Highlands, his body buried deep in the woods. Others swore they had seen him years later, walking along the docks at night, an old man with sharp eyes, watching everything and saying nothing. Whether he was alive or dead didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the fear his story inspired. For detectives who had worked the old case, the memory of Calum Reid never faded. Operation Vantage had destroyed much of his network, but they never found him. No fingerprints, no bank traces, not even a whisper from informants. It was as if he had dissolved into the air. Some officers admitted privately that they admired him, not for his crimes, but for the way he had disappeared so completely. In a world where everyone eventually fell, the ghost had simply walked away. The underworld, however, paid a higher price. Calum's final act, the execution that ended Euan Drummond's life, had changed everything. It sent a message that betrayal was unforgivable, that loyalty had limits, and that revenge would always find its way back. But it also shattered the fragile balance that had kept Glasgow's criminal world from imploding. After Calum vanished, his order died with him. Gangs turned on each other for scraps of territory, and young men who didn't understand the old ways spilled blood for reputation instead of respect. The streets became louder, messier, and far more dangerous. The discipline the ghost had enforced through fear and silence was gone forever. Yet, now and then, strange things happened. A drug runner who double-crossed his crew disappeared without a trace. A warehouse tied to a violent gang burned to the ground in the middle of the night. In every case, no one claimed responsibility, and no evidence was ever found. Still, in hushed tones, people repeated the same theory. The ghost had returned. Whether it was truth or paranoia didn't matter. The myth was alive. And in the criminal world, myth is often more powerful than fact. Somewhere in the cold north, in a quiet cabin near a forgotten lock, an old man sat by a fire. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a drink. The world had moved on, but he hadn't. He still kept a small box of newspaper clippings, stories of crimes, arrests, disappearances. His eyes lingered on them as if searching for something only he could understand. Outside, the wind howled across the empty land. Calum Reid had become what he was always meant to be: a shadow, a warning, a story whispered by those who thought they understood power. The Gangland Execution that had once shocked Scotland had done more than kill a man. It had ended an era, and though the ghost himself would one day fade completely from memory, the fear he left behind would never die. In Glasgow's dark corners, his legend still walked, silent, unseen, and eternal.